Hey, this is Jay Watts from Merely Human Ministries. Welcome to the Human Things Podcast. I have the slightest idea what episode or season we're in, but let's just go with it.
3, 2, 1.
Here we go!
It'll show up on a graphic somewhere. Somewhere we will have a graphic. This is an auspicious occasion, a sad occasion for me. This is the last of the podcast in this studio. So no more podcast with JD sitting across the table for me. No more of the lovely background here. They have been blessed with a life in a different place, and it has made it impossible for them to continue. So I will continue to do human things in one form or another. That's just what we're going to be figuring out as we go forward. A lot of shorts coming out, this episode coming out, and then we will be adjusting. Next, I would like to point out my patriotic Snoopy shirt, which I acquired at Buc-ee's. I was lucky. And first of all, I will accept no Buc-ee's slander in my life. I think Buc-ee's is just a marvel of the modern world. I've said before that we live in the age of the golden age of gas station food, between Quick Trip, Wawa, Buc-ee's. I'm forgetting some of the other ones I like to stop at while I'm out on the road because I drive a lot. So I drive, but I have changed routes to make sure that I stop at Buc-ee's. And my son and I were on our way down to the lovely Brunswick, Georgia, headed towards Sea Island and St. Simons because my mother was moving into an assisted living facility and they needed help moving some heavy stuff. That's me. I mean, y'all can move the boxes, but when it comes time to lift the manly things, I'm the one they call. Okay, so not to just take a moment to brag a little bit, but yeah, the man was going to lift the heavy things, and so, but we were driving down the road, my sister who lives down in that area had told me, hey, look, they're building, I think the world's largest Buc-ee's, right down there by Brunswick, and so we're driving down the road, and I tell my son as we start to get close to the Brunswick area, I said, look, they're building a huge Buc-ee's in this area. And then we see it, and they don't have the signs up. One of the great things about Buc-ee's is the signs. As you go down the road, we see it, and there's flags everywhere, and it looks like there's people or traffic going in. It looks open. Let's just pull in and see what's going on. We were there hours after it opened, opening day, and man, this was an event. The corporate Buc-ee's people were there. The guy who started or owns Buc-ee's or whatever, his daughter has written a children's book that they sell at Buc-ee's, and she was there signing copies for people. So they're buying, and the mayor of Brunswick was there, and state representatives and state senators were there, and they did a ribbon cutting. I mean, this thing was huge. It was a very exciting event. People lost their minds. It was the most difficulty I ever had finding a parking space, and at a Buc-ee's. I got lucky. I drove around for a little bit, dropped my son off so he could go in and start doing his Buc-ee's experience. And then I found a space pretty close to the building, right next to the ribbon cutting. So I get out of my car and walking out, and they're getting set up for the ribbon cutting. I'm there for everything, man. This was a big deal to my family. I don't know why, but I feel a deep spiritual connection now to that Buc-ee's. I was there when it opened. First day, I was there. First hours of it opening, and this is the T-shirt I got. I got a Snoopy patriotic T-shirt because there's just so much of me in this shirt. I love America and I love Snoopy. It's also got Woodstock there as well, who's carrying his own. It says USA, but you can't really see that. Like, whoa. But anyway, I don't know why I'm talking about how much, I guess just the shirt. The shirt. This show, filming it with JD, gave me an excuse to buy a lot of graphic tees. And I was able to make my wife believe that this was a thing I had to do for work. And so I have a bunch of really weird graphic tees. Now I'm always on the look for more. I love them. And so this is my Buc-ee's shirt. Okay, moving on past Buc-ee's. This will be a shorter episode. We've just recorded a lot of shorts that will be coming out talking about the questions that I was asked, a list of questions that I was giving from college students. Be on the lookout for those. And then we're going to do this because there's two things I wanted to talk about. The first one is a book that I read recently a couple of times, read it again after having read it once, because the idea in it was interesting as far as the world that we live in today. I try to be open and honest in ministry as far as who I am. And because I'm more interested, I know not everybody believes in callings. Not everybody believes that God's called you to ministry. I do. I believe that, but I don't believe that I was called into ministry in a generic way. I believe that Jay was called into ministry. And so if Jay is going to be any use in ministry, he has to be authentically Christian and authentically Jay. And that means that it's not my job to figure out what I should say. It's my job to represent who I am, and hopefully that God can make some use of that. And I will say this about Jay Watts right now. As a man of God and as an individual, I find the current political world that we live in very unsettling. Not in a sense like I hate Donald Trump or I hate the Democrats. I think they're both a lot of idiocy to go along on both sides right now. I want so badly to be able to identify really great guys that I'm on side of. And I will say this, Marco Rubio has said some things recently that I see him defending particular viewpoints that are in actions that the government is taking. Like, okay, well, at least he makes sense. I mean, he seems like an adult. I like listening to him talk. I don't get a chance to listen to a lot of them. And then people turn around and like this weird hostile takeover of the Kennedy Center, that where not only did Donald Trump oust the leader and then got involved in who they're going to give Kennedy awards to, but also I understand, I think I heard today, this may have been reported wrongly, but NPR was reporting today that he is running the event now. Like he's going to be up there emceeing the event or something. It's like, and he even said, it was fun in an interview with Donald Trump. I mean, in a way, only Donald Trump could answer, right? They asked him, and he was like, well, we shouldn't get everything political, but they made the Oscars political, and that hurt the ball, and it hurt the Oscars. It hurt the Oscars. I mean, the way he talks, it hurt him. It did. But we're going to get our own political thing, and we'll see what it does to us. So we're going to do a political thing for the Kennedy Center. So it ought to be interesting to see. The world is filled right now with a very serious series of events, like dangerously, wars, discord. Ariana Hirsiali talking about the fall of the West in Europe, because you have incompatible cultures mixing with each other, and one is having more children than the other. I mean, you just have warnings and people doom scrolling or feeling worse about things, but there are very serious things happening in the world, and it can be difficult to sort through the seriousness of what's going on in the world with some of the sometimes unserious people that we have either telling us about what's going on in the world. I mean, too many people getting their news from comedians, or agents within this. The people who believe, I remember I've seen Douglas Murray talking about the narcissism on young people who believe that they can dictate the policies of foreign powers through their Threads posts, Facebook posts, Instagram posts, TikToks, whatever. That there's just a deeply narcissistic. So the world is in a strange place, and you see conflict of worldviews in a way that I don't remember seeing. And I know that we all have a tendency to see those things and say, well, it's never been like this before, but I don't remember it ever being this divided. And not just here. Now, part of that may be that we have more information than we've ever had before, and immediately information about what's going on all over the world. And at the same time, everybody's free to share their opinions on platforms. And so you're inundated with the opinions, even the crazy opinions of people. I think that's why life is so much more reasonable offline, where you go out there and you just talk to your neighbors. And even when they disagree with you, you rarely are like yelling and screaming at each other, although there does seem to be an uptick of that as well. So all of this to say, determining a Christian response to the world around me is more difficult now, I think, than it's ever been for me. Because my first loyalty, my first devotion is always to Jesus, is always to Christ. I like him more than anything else. And my conversion to Christianity, from the path that I went through from atheism to agnosticism to ultimately Christianity, led me to a place where that was the reason. I've mentioned that many times. The reason I devoted my life to Christ was because I came to a point where I realized that everyone lives for something. And I had already lived for myself, and that was a failure. I'm just not that interesting. And there's something that everybody, some principle, some idea that everybody has committed their life to. And I committed my life to the person of Jesus Christ. And to this day, I just believe he's better. And I believe that the way he teaches me to be is better. Not just for me, but for my wife and for my children and for my neighbors. I believe that the commands that he's given me by which I am to live my life make me a better human being. And I believe that such a thing as the way I ought to be exists, and that it was exemplified to the person of Jesus Christ. And I spend my life trying to live up to that, failing miserably all the time, but never losing sight of the goal. I will say, in addition to that, that I have never prayed as much in my life as I pray now. I don't know if it's a maturity thing, if I've just gotten older. I don't know if it's a stress thing. I don't know if it's just that I have more to lose probably now than I've ever had before. I don't know which one of those it is, but I have never prayed more. And I have found that praying more helps me to be more of what I ought to be. So getting to the point that I wanted to discuss now, there is the man Jay who wishes to be the best version of himself, the most Christian version of himself he can be. And then there's the world around me. And you're wondering, what does good governance look like? And I'd read a couple times the book by Reinhold Niebuhr, Moral Men and Immoral Societies. Now, I'm like all people, I will give this caveat when I talk about anybody who's written a book. One of my favorite things that I ever read was written by a guy named John Rawls, who disagreed with me fundamentally on the way that he saw the world and what he advocated for in his moral philosophy as far as the way to approach and to govern and how to establish law and understanding. But Rawls said something I thought was fascinating, and it changed the way that I think through the people that I read. He said, I take it as axiomatic. I take it as given that the people that I'm reading are smarter than me. Or else, why would I be reading them? Why would I be reading dumb people? That would be a waste of my time. So he said, I take it as axiomatic that the people I'm reading are smarter than me. Even when they disagree with me, I want to read the smartest versions of those disagreements that I can find. And what that does is it puts you in a posture of coming to listen to somebody, particularly people that we're deeply skeptical of because they have a different view of the world that we have. But if I find somebody smart that holds a view that I disagree with, I go into the conversation recognizing this. This person can teach me something. They know something I don't know. They have ideas I may not have considered. I don't know. But I need to approach it from that position that Rawls talked about, that I have to assume they're smarter than me, or else why am I reading them? And since I'm going to them to read, I'm going to them to teach me their point of view. And I have to be humble enough to say, given our deep disagreements, I can learn from you. You have something to teach me. And in Moral Men and Immoral Societies, Reinhold Niebuhr is arguing a very specific thesis. The pressures that work to make men moral, the spiritual, godly, scriptural, social pressures to make men moral cannot work on a societal level. You can make a man moral through a certain path in relationships. You cannot make a society moral because there are no pressures that can make them moral. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have society. It doesn't mean that we don't have laws. What he's saying is that we just have to recognize that the ordering of society cannot produce a good society, a morally good society. We can create an order, hopefully, that will do the best that we can to provide the things that a society ought to provide to its members. Safety being the first of those things. But you can't make them moral. You can restrict their behavior. And moral people will follow it. Cormac McCarthy in No Country for Old Men has the quote in there. I'm going to butcher it, but something to the effect that, moral people don't need laws. They're good. and bad people can't be governed. and that goes along with the same thing that Reinhold Niebuhr, that dovetails very nicely with Niebuhr's point. Bad people can't be governed at all. And good people don't need the laws to control them. And so in some way or another, the law is always going to be the use of force. I mentioned Ariane Hirsi Ali earlier. She was talking about a leader in Europe who said that they had lost the monopoly of violence in their country because the immigration problem has become such in their country that they cannot control. There are violent elements within the country that are operating outside of the law now. And I thought that was such a fascinating way as she shared that, to hear that concept, the monopoly of violence owned by the government or society. They monopolize violence. Even if you read the autobiography and the writings of Gandhi, who was one of the, literally is the picture of nonviolence for most people. When you think of nonviolence and you want to give an image to it, Gandhi for a lot of people will be that image. And even Gandhi supported this concept of the monopoly of violence. He said there will never be a society that can exist without violence, but you can minimize it, and violence can be used to suppress the violent tendencies of our order. Those people that Cormac McCarthy says cannot be governed will ultimately only be restrained through violence. And Reinhold Niebuhr says in response to that, that means that we can't make society moral. So our goal is to make it safe. Our goal is to make it ordered, fair, all of these things. But we can't make it moral. That's not a legitimate goal for making society. Now, again, as I said, going into this, I don't agree with everything Niebuhr wrote, but I think there's something very important to parse through there. If you're a Christian, or if you're like me and you're deeply uncomfortable with the world around you, but you're distrustful of a lot of institutions, right? I'm not, look, I'm very critical of any area where I think people ought to be criticized, and I think it's healthy for criticism, and I accept it all the time from people as well. I cannot ever back a party that as part of its platform is that it's a fundamental right to destroy your children before they're born. That's kind of a big deal for me, both personally and philosophically. The idea that I am to love my neighbor as myself, and I believe that the best philosophical and scientific arguments out there demonstrate that the unborn are one of my neighbors, and if I'm to love them myself, I owe them the same basic duty and obligations that I owe to anybody else, and I ought to refrain from killing them. And so if you're part of a political party that says central to our identity as a political party is the freedom to kill them as much as you like, then you and I just cannot get along, and I cannot support you. I'm not capable of finding a home in your party. It doesn't exist. There's no place for me in there. But the Republican Party, as we've talked about many times on this, ran from that issue as well and for to get elected. They're not against me, but I don't know that they're for that issue anymore either, at least in a limited capacity. And it's less than it was. And the fact that they won by doing that is what makes me a little uncomfortable. Because anytime they can win without you, they get the lesson, I can win without you. And then the next time we'll see so we'll see the next election, what happens then. So what do we do then? Well, I think that we've mentioned a couple of things already just in passing as I've talked. No doom scrolling. Don't live your life worried about what's going on in the international. I cannot stop anything. I could sit here and pontificate about or share my own personal ideas about like what's going on in Israel, what's going on in Russia. And that might sate a certain person out there that wants to hear me agree with them, because that's why you went online anyway. Most people aren't going online to find the person that's challenging their views. Most people are going online because they're looking for somebody, they're looking for that confirmation bias. It makes me feel better to find somebody who feels the way that I do about this and expresses it in the echo chamber that I'm looking to get myself into. So sharing my views on those things will not affect Netanyahu. They will not affect Putin. They will not affect Hamas. They will not affect any of the agents out there that are acting right now. And quite frankly, I have a low information. I've done my best. I've read books. I've listened to reporters. And even now, I feel like I lack information to be able to speak clearly. I mean, obviously I have personal feelings when I see people out there protesting for particular things. And it's like, look, I know you don't like Trump and I know you don't like Israel, but how the heck did Hamas become the good guys in all of this? Or I know you don't like Trump, but why are you cheering for China? My gosh. I mean, that's a whole other dysfunction that's going on out there in the world. Or people saying, well, I'm leaving the United States. Well, good luck in Barcelona because they're shooting you with water guns and don't want Americans coming over there. And the Cotswolds and the people that live in that area have just said, look, we don't want every American coming over into the idyllic part of England and taking it over. In Mexico City, they're protesting Americans coming there. Guess what? The world doesn't want us running away from America and coming into their countries. They find us irritating. So just stay home and sort it all out here, I guess. But this idea that there's some part of the world that's doing better is crazy. Go learn about the world. It is nuts out there right now. So what do we do if there's no way to make a moral society? Well, first of all, I focus on those local things. I focus on me, the most local institution that I have, the person Jay. I focus on my family. How can I help them be good people? Not how can I be the most politically effective people in the world, but how can I help them to be good people? How can I help them to reach their goals? When we did this last Thanksgiving episode, which, by the way, I'll say this, JD, that Thanksgiving episode that we recorded this last year where we talked about and read the different letters and the different proclamations of Thanksgiving, it's one of my favorite things we've ever done on this. I had so much fun both researching it and talking about it. But one of the things that I thought was so telling in all of those proclamations for Thanksgiving in the early United States was that the reason for Thanksgiving was to reorder ourselves and where we belong in our relationship with our Creator, who is the person who blesses us and makes our ordered society possible. And that if we are grateful as people, if we operate in a spirit of gratitude and He gives us His blessing, us being good people makes us better Americans. Americans being filled with good people makes us a better nation on the world stage. All of this gets better if we attend to our own souls. And we magnify the amount of goodness in the world, not by developing policy that establishes goodness, because that may not be a thing that can be done at all, but by becoming good people and thereby seeking good through our public action. Now, it is an important caveat. I am not saying at all that we cannot legislate morality. That's all we legislate. All legislation is the legislation of somebody's morality. All law is moral law on some way or another. It is not possible. I have played this game in front of college students for 2 decades, where when this comes up and somebody says we can't legislate morality, tell me something that we legislate that's not moral. And I remember one guy standing up, well, whether you drive on the right side or the left side of the street, that's not moral. That's arbitrary. I'm like, yes, whether it's the right or left side is arbitrary. That is correct. But that we ought to drive on one side or the other by a matter of law is not arbitrary. It's a moral decision based on the idea that it is immoral to have that chaos on the street because people unnecessarily die, which is a bad thing because human life is precious. And so we have to order the movement upon our highways and our roads in such a way that we protect human life. It is a moral law. All legislation is morality. And it's to restrict the bad people, primarily. And that's something that you see, which is interesting because one of the things that sparked this conversation for me was when the recent talk of how President Trump is federalizing the law enforcement in the District of Columbia because crime is out of control. And if you listen to these arguments, it is absolutely nuts, the talking points that people are using out there. And immediately they're like, well, he's doing it because I actually heard this. This was the craziest thing on the way. And I was listening to NPR on the way here, JD, and they're talking about the murder rate. The murder rate in DC. And they said, well, it's come down 30%. Now, by the way, this is not just DC. It's not, they say, well, that means that the people in DC are doing a good job. What happened was in 2021, 22, 23, over that 4-year period, the murder rate shot up everywhere. We had been on a decline for decades. The violent crime rate was going down for decades. All of a sudden, 2021, COVID, I don't know, the world went nuts. Violent crime rate launched up into a bigger place. And then now it's correcting and coming back down to something more reasonable. I don't know what happened in those 4 years. Nobody fully understands what happened. Nobody fully understands what explains the decline of the violent crime rate, nor do we understand why it spiked there. We can come up with all sorts of theories, but now it's coming back down. It tends to be coming back down everywhere if you listen to statisticians that focus on this, that you're seeing this peak that we hit, this rise, this elevation, and now it's resettling back. The point I wanted to make was they were talking about, is this the acceptable level of homicide? Said, I don't know if this is an acceptable level of homicide, but it's gone down 30%. JD, what's the acceptable level of homicide? That's 0. Yeah, right. Exactly. That to me is like the easiest question anybody will ever ask me. What is the acceptable level of homicide in our community? That would be 0. And rape, 0. Violent crime, 0. Theft, 0. We just should not be doing these things at all. The acceptable level of all of them is 0. What's the livable level? I don't know. But the idea that the response... Now, let us say this. I have not heard anyone, even people who love him and who have worked with him and admire him, accuse Donald Trump of being a big reader. They said that he likes very short policy briefings, it is said. He is very confident in his ability to hear a policy briefing in a very short way and then make the right decision. Very confident in that. Those are the reports that I hear from people that have worked with him. And so he sees crime. I don't know where he's seeing it. And he says something must be done to stop that violent crime. And if it's not being done by the district police and the district government, then we will step in and do this because this is the nation's capital. This is the capital of the United States. And I will say this in addition to that, not supporting him, but just saying his conversations, we talked about it. Crime, when I've talked to people who work in areas of crime, they say crime exists at the level that it's accepted. Always. Let me give you a quick analogy. Coaching lacrosse, boys lacrosse. Boys lacrosse is an insane game of violence. They hit each other with the lacrosse sticks, and there are rules to govern how they're allowed to hit each other, how they're allowed to body check, how they're allowed to swing those, where they're allowed to hit on the body with those sticks. So in any given game, you have a group of officials. And just like any sport, some officials call the game differently than others. And if you have a group of people, a group of officials in this given game, and there's at least 2 in a boys' high school game that are letting it go, the game will immediately be played at the level that they are allowing the violence to happen. You don't have to tell people. I never once had to tell my team when they said, look, they're letting the checks happen, so be a little freer with the checks until they get us back in so that we can. You don't have to tell a group of high school boys to be violent. They're good to go. And the second that they see that you're allowing a level of violence, that's the level of violence that they play, at which they execute the entire game until you pull it back. And I have had conversations. There was a game where I had to call a timeout in a fall game, which doesn't matter because lacrosse is a spring sport, where I called a timeout and my team thought I wanted to talk to them. And as they're walking to the sideline, I walked straight past my team and went straight up to the official. And I explained to them, this is a fall game. This is a developmental league. These kids are supposed to be out here so they can learn how to play lacrosse. And you need to call this game like you understand it's your job to keep them safe. Somebody's going to the hospital if you don't get this game back under control. This is insane what you're letting people get away with. But it's the nature of people to do exactly what you'll allow them to do. Frederick Douglass talked about this when he was talking about the idea of living as an oppressed people. He said the oppressors, he's talking about those who hold us and slave. They will do exactly what we allow them to do, and they will not give it up except by force. If they have gotten used to the idea that they can do a certain amount of things to us, to push them back will require force. You will have to demand. He says, it will take a demand to get my freedom back. I cannot ask nicely. They have gone to the level of violence that they've been allowed to go to, and now it has to be pushed back. It will only be returned as a demand, not as a request. And that's what I told that guy in that film. And so in a society where it feels like things are getting out of control, the impulse to say the demand for control must come back. We have to police. There is no acceptable level of violence, no acceptable level of murder, no acceptable level of sexual assault. Let's get it back under control. And the best way to get them back under control would be for the people to control themselves, to make moral men and women. But in order to do that, we have to win a worldview battle personally. So as a personal approach, I am focusing my energy on the worldview battle in recognition that the greater political battle is just not something I am equipped nor empowered to win. And under the belief that if we can win a worldview battle, we make better people. And just like the founding fathers talked about and those early people in the government and those Thanksgiving proclamations, better people make better government. A better government makes a better nation. It is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, of the people. If the government is chaos, it's because the people are chaos. So my job is to do everything that I can to make better people. Recognizing the importance of laws to restrain the actions of evil as best we can. But to recognize the limits of laws, they can't make good people while they restrict evil. That's what they can do. So, sorting this out, I was talking to a guy who runs a ministry, brilliant guy, and he said, look, localizing is the answer. Focus your energy, your power, and your love locally. Love your family, love your church, love your community. Get involved as best you can to make your world better at that level. Don't get distracted about things that you cannot change. Don't sit around depressed and upset about things that have nothing to do with you in the sense of that you have no actionable activity. You cannot change it. You can speak about it when you're given the opportunity, but don't let it distract you from what you can do right now. And what happens when we don't do that, when we get caught up in these ideas of when we see ourselves as avatars for ideologies or worldviews, then we break company with people. I saw this guy just the other day. I don't know why I ever get on Threads, JD. I don't know why I ever get on Threads. I don't know why I ever do it, but I did it again. It was a mistake. And one of the first people I see is a guy saying that he would not go to a wedding of a dear friend of his because she was marrying a conservative. And his position was now stressing his marriage because of the fights that were happening. And he said this proudly. He was standing on business for the worldview that he represents to the point that it was destroying personal relationships with people he loves. And he thought he was some kind of hero. You're hearing Stephen King talk about he and his brother don't talk to each other because his brother likes Trump. I'm like, buddy, talk to your brother. It doesn't matter who's in office. He's your brother. Go talk to your daggone brother. Love your brother. Don't be a jerk. Don't be an idiot. You're not an avatar for a political party or an ideology. You're a human being. Be one. And if the person next to you disagrees with you, so what? Just talk to them. You're much more likely to affect their worldview by talking to them and being a good human being in their life than you are by shutting them out. So act locally, live locally, focus my universe on the local as much as I can. I'm informed. I'll talk about those other things, but the world doesn't need me to be a voice out there about those things. As much as it may aggravate people, I'm going to preach the love, grace, and mercy of Jesus Christ to a world that desperately needs it. And at that, there will be contention, right? Because you can't tell somebody they're wrong nicely. No matter how nicely you say it, you're wrong. You need to focus on yourself. You need to find the call. You need to get in line with God's teaching and to live as the person of Jesus Christ would have you live, to reflect him in the world, to be an ambassador for the kingdom of God in this world around us. You need to recognize that men can become moral, and more moral men is good for us all. So let's focus my efforts on that while keeping a wary eye on how we can limit evil through government. Because that is a power in a legitimate operation of the government. Okay, so that's that. That's what I'm talking about. All right, so next, it's been a while, And so we're going to do or react a little bit to a Joe Rogan interview that happened a bit now ago with a guy by the name of James Tallarico. James Tallarico is a Texas House representative, state representative. He is a very educated guy. Went to Harvard to get his master's in education. University of Texas, Austin, got his BA. He's a pastor and was a school teacher. And now he's a representative. And Joe Rogan says he should run for president because he's so reasonable. And I heard him talking about abortion, and I thought, okay, there's a lot he said across the board that I would like to interact with. I will say his tone throughout the entire interview is that people on both sides ought to be able to have a reasonable conversation about their disagreement. 100% agree with him. 100% agree. So I don't want this interaction with what he said to be seen as uncharitable. I just think he's wrong. And there's things that I want to respond to about what he said because his platform became so elevated and because, Joe Rogan admittedly smokes a lot of pot. I don't know if he's stoned on his show, but he's listening to him and taking this all very seriously enough that he thinks this guy should run for president. And I do believe that Joe Rogan's endorsement helped President Trump to win his second election. I do believe that he has an audience, a massive audience that takes him very seriously. And in the inroads that he made into those types of podcast worlds, when Kamala Harris demonstrated her inability to talk like a human being for more than like a minute, it is still to me. I know we did a whole podcast episode about this where we discussed how awful that ticket was, how embarrassingly bad they were at talking. She's coming back, man. She's getting ready for a presidential run. She's coming back. How you lost to Trump, man. I mean, you were bad. You were a bad candidate. And it wasn't just like your policies were unpopular. You were so weird anytime anybody tried to talk to you. So it's this, in this particular case, the fact that this guy is so convincing, he was able to go on to Joe Rogan's podcast and make a case for his views and then gain the popularity that he did and then the endorsement of Joe Rogan to be a presidential candidate. I think that's worth noting. So let's listen to what he has to say. We're going to start and I'll respond to here or there about what his viewpoints, but I want to address some of his arguments about abortion directly.
And I think if we're looking at the last 40, 50 years, the religious right has made a concerted effort to make homosexuality and abortion the two biggest issues for Christians. And, the Southern Baptist Convention was pro-choice until the late 1970s.
I just want to cover that really quick. Because the Southern Baptist Convention was pro-choice until the late 1970s. Well, abortion wasn't legalized nationally until 1973. Up to that point, it was illegal in most of the United States. There wasn't a lot of political reason for them to have had an express position on this. And early on, I think everybody was trying to figure out what they were supposed to do in response to Roe v. Wade. There were people that were arguing that this was the way to love your neighbor, to love women, to empower women, to be able to make that choice for themselves. But upon reflection and the advocacy of certain members within the Southern Baptist Convention, I've talked to actually people that went through this process and were a part of leading them in that direction. When they were presented with good arguments, both moral arguments, philosophical arguments, scientific arguments, biblical arguments, they changed their mind and decided they were wrong. And since then have been a consistent voice against abortion in the United States. By the way, they're not the biggest group of Christians in the United States. I mean, the Catholic Church was always against it. They were fighting it from the beginning. There were other aspects of the Christian church that were against it from the beginning. So the fact that at the time that those things changed and became a national issue, it took a little while for them to change their whole view of the entire convention to being pro-life. I don't think it. I think his using that is a little. I don't want to say disingenuous because I don't think he's trying to be deceptive. I think he does say at one point he hasn't thought about all this very much, and to say, well, they were pro-choice until the late 70s. Well, there'd be no reason for them to be either pro-life or pro-choice until the late 70s, right? That was exactly when all these decisions had to be made, at least on a national level like this, because What Roe v. Wade did was take something that was legal in fewer states and make it legal in every state on a national level. And so that's why, I mean, I think you can make more than that than you necessarily need to make.
When was abortion even invented?
Well, there were certainly abortions in the ancient world.
Again, no offense, but when was abortion invented? It's like we're talking about cameras or cars or something like that. So who invented abortion? I think Joseph Della Pena in his book Dispelling the Myths of Abortion History, which is a massive book, talking about the myths of abortion history. He begins it as saying we can take it as axiomatic that abortion has always existed as long as there have been women who didn't want to be pregnant. There have always been women who are desperate enough to try to end that pregnancy at great risk to themselves. Which, by the way, I don't think the question is bad. I think it's just weirdly worded. I don't want to be insulting to him because it is actually an important point that's made, and Joseph Della Pena makes it in his book Dispelling the Myths of Abortion History, that until the rise of medical science, which would be the late 19th century, early 20th century, really medical science, about the Civil War, you see this transfer over from the sort of old school science where he talked about humors and bleeding people and you put leeches on them and all the things that ultimately led to the death of somebody like George Washington, where he got really sick and like, quick, let's get all that blood out of him. Obviously he's red because he has too much blood. Get it out of him. That was the way that they practiced medicine for a while. We need to balance the fluids in his body. And this redness that we see in him caused by this fever means that he is filled with excess of blood. Get it out of him. That was the world of medicine back then. It's one of my favorite lines in any movie is in Sense and Sensibility, when they're like, that doctor's a fine physician. And then you see him just draining blood out of this sick girl. Like, that's not a fine physician. He's not a first-class physician. He's a quack who is getting money for killing people. If you survive his treatments, you have survived his assault on your body. He did not help you in any given way. We didn't have any idea, by the way, until the rise of medical science of things like bacteria and ways to fight it. And I mean, this is all new information, a new way to study the body, a new application of medicine that really lands in 1918 with the Spanish influenza. It was the first time that we had this pandemic of the Spanish influenza starting in the war and then spreading all over the world, that you had the first major medical crisis that was handled primarily with modern medical science. Why is that important? Because prior to that, all the kind of things that you would do to perform abortions reliably would have been invasive or poisonous, right? We did not cut people open because we didn't understand what bacteria was, and we didn't understand the infections that we were opening the body to, and we had no way to protect them against that, and their wounds would have just become infected, and they would have died because we didn't know what we were doing. And any successful medical treatment was just lucky because we had no idea of what we were actually treating in any of these things. And so when women would take pessaries, or they would take pennyroyal, or they would take something like that would make them they were poisoning themselves, and they were as likely to die from the poison as the child they were trying to destroy. And the same thing for methods that were done to hurt them from the outside, or intrusive or invasive methods. Anything that was likely to kill the unborn child was also threatening or likely to kill them, to the point that Joseph Della Pena says looking for an abortion was almost tantamount to being suicidal. You were so desperate to get rid of the child, you were willing to risk your life to do it. But people did do it. And there were any number of ways that they tried to do it, but the reliability of abortion as a modern science practice, that is a 20th century phenomenon. Because we understand bacteria. For the first time, we can use antibiotics to fight bacterial infection. We understand the more what's going on inside of a woman through the development of her child than we've ever understood before. And we're able to reliably and consistently start to kill her child before it's born without risking her life. So the question is weirdly worded, but it's fair. And for them to say, well, abortion's always been around, that is seriously either ill-informed or disingenuous. They've given no serious thought to this whatsoever. And by the way, the number one reason that you wouldn't have had abortion for so long was because abortion was crazy dangerous, but infanticide was not. So we know the Romans left them on hills so that they would die. We know that infanticide was happening on a wide scale in the British Empire. We see it all throughout history. Infanticide was safer. That's why you have concealment laws. It's illegal to conceal that you're pregnant because we don't want some buxom woman hiding her pregnancy and then killing her child as soon as it's born, because the only reason you'd be hiding it is because you don't want to be pregnant, because you don't want the kids, so you're going to kind of get rid of it. So infanticide was how they got rid of unwanted babies throughout most of human history, not abortion.
And again, I haven't studied this enough to say this definitively, but there are interpretations of certain passages from the Torah where some folks will even say that there's some subtle instructions for how to perform an abortion in the ancient world, certain things to drink.
We did a whole show on that, so I'm not going to repeat it. I'll link. Make sure we have a link to that show talking about that. But let's just say the only accurate thing he says in that entire bit that we just covered there was he hasn't studied enough and he doesn't know what he's talking about. Because the interpretation he's talking about is wildly out of context and misunderstanding what the scriptures say. And he is absolutely 100% right that he has not studied it. He doesn't know what he's talking about, and he should be more careful about that.
The point is that this idea that there is a set Christian orthodoxy on the issue of abortion is just not rooted in Scripture. We can have an honest debate about it. If Pope Francis, were to come back and sit at this table and tell me, James, I'm pro-life and anti-abortion, here's my theological argument, I'm here to listen and respect that opinion. I have dear friends who are anti-abortion. All I'm asking is that for Christians who are pro-choice and who respect the bodily autonomy of women, that we be given the space to make our theological argument, because I think there is a lot of biblical evidence to support that opinion.
Okay, let's hold it right there for a second, because he says there's no scriptural basis for the pro-life view. All right. Thou shalt not murder is a pretty definitive statement. So then the question then becomes, are they human? Are they one of us? Does the moral law, the moral prohibition against destroying human life, apply to them? The burden will be on the person that says that it doesn't. That is a category of human life that we're allowed to kill. No, I agree. I'm going to let him make his case in a second here, because he is going to give his reasons when given the opportunity to do so. But I do want to point out that thou shalt not kill is pretty definitive. And also, in addition to that, the Bible is as pro-child as you can possibly get, in the sense that being pregnant and having children, many children, is a sign of a blessing. That people who cannot have children and cannot bear children are seen as cursed, barren, embarrassed, humiliated, struggling, mocked, and made fun of. That in a book where he claims that there's no pro-life case, definitive pro-life case, we see as Mary and Elizabeth see each other, and Mary is a newly conceived, an embryonic Jesus inside of her, and let's give Elizabeth, she has a fetal John the Baptist inside of her, that at the presence of an embryonic Lord, a fetal John the Baptist leaps in her belly in the presence, and she declares, Elizabeth declares at that point about who Christ is actively at that point, even as an embryo, and John the Baptist acting in accordance of his character that we will see later in life as a fetus. We are given to understand that we are, each and every one of us, crafted for a purpose and a reason, and that God, at least particularly in this case, Jeremiah, he knit him in his womb. So, or he fashioned him, and you'll see that in the Psalms as well, as the knitting in the womb, this concept, this idea of God forming not just life in this sort of generic sense, but individual life from the very beginning, and guiding it through its process to the point that he will make use of that individual. So to say there's no definitive case is only to say that God never says abortion is wrong. But Ronald Sider produced a book. And Ronald Sider, not exactly some kind of conservative scholar, right? But Ronald Sider produced a book where he talks about abortion in the early church. And he produces quite a bit of evidence that abortion was always considered wrong in those communities. Why would a community that valued family endorse or approve the killing of children before they're born when children were seen as a blessing? And the early church was emphatic about the idea of destroying children, particularly before they're born and afterwards, in both of those cases, as condemning them outright. To say that it's not explicitly forbidden is just to say that a community that saw all life as precious, all human beings ought to be treated as having value in the sense that you are not allowed to kill them, that murder is one of the basic moral condemnations of the law, and that a culture that cherishes child didn't need somebody to come along and tell them explicitly, oh, don't abort your children, especially since it condemned societies that did sacrifice their children. So it's a weird, you're going to have to provide something to go against the entire scope of the Bible that says in this particular case, there is a reason to believe that we're permitted to do this. You don't just get to say, as Hadley Arcus talks about, I think it's in Natural Rights and the Right to Choose, he says that the absence of consensus is not an absence of truth. Just because there are Christians out there that don't adhere to a pro-life position doesn't mean that the pro-life position isn't true, or nor does it mean that the pro-life position isn't consistent with church teaching all along. What it means is that there's some people that disagree. And if you disagree that the Bible and teaching that murder or destroying other human life is wrong, and the scientific or philosophical argument that the unborn are one of us, and that there's clear teachings that the Bible sees human life as consistent from the moment it comes into existence all the way through, well, then you're going to have to provide strong evidence against that. Because the book itself is incredibly pro-child in the sense that children are a blessing, and having children is a blessing to your family, and not having children is a curse. But let's let him make his case.
What do you think is the biblical evidence to support the opinion of being pro-abortion?
So one, in Genesis, God creates life by breathing life into the first human being, which we later call Adam. That life starts when you take your first breath, and that is actually the mainline position in Judaism, is that that's when life starts.
His first line of evidence to support the pro-choice position is that God breathed life into Adam, and so, therefore, our value, our humanity begins when we breathe. All right, now, let's look at Genesis chapter 2, verse 5. We'll start. When no bush of the field was yet in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up, and the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the land, and there was no man to work the ground, and a mist was going up from the land and was watering the whole face of the ground. Then the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. So that's descriptive in Genesis chapter 2, in verse 6 and 7, about how he forms him of the dust of the ground. But at this point, this formation, this thing is inanimate. And then he breathes life into it, animating it, making it alive. This is descriptive of this event. Now, what James Tallarico is doing is he's taking a descriptive event and making it normative. He's saying, since when he fashioned man, he breathed life into him, at our first breath, we apparently join the family of Adam. But until then, we're not alive. And he says, and this is the Jewish tradition. This is how it's understood in the Jewish tradition. The life begins at the first breath. Okay, well, that's fine. As far as saying this to Jewish tradition, that's an appeal to authority. I'm not particularly interested in it. Not because I'm not interested in Jewish teaching, but because I think it's just fundamentally wrong. I mean, we know things about the development of human life that we didn't know back then, and we're able to chart that development. We understand the complexity of human life and how it grows and how it begins with information. And from the moment it exists, from the moment it's a single-celled organism, it has the genetic material that will dictate in relationship with its environment, its development from then on out. And there were things that will certainly be expressed at that moment that are there. And there are things that might be expressed later on, but all of the genetic information is there from the very beginning. We just understand so much more about life than they did at this point. But what we can't do is go and take the description of a single event and then say that description is now normative as how we understand all life, because God never said all the rest of human beings that come into existence are only alive when I breathe life into them, which, by the way, is really odd. Now, there's the discussion of when souls come into human beings is always an odd discussion. Does it come at birth? Are they created? Are they inherited in some way so that there's a soul that passes from the mom and the father into the child and some new soul is made through that? Or does God create a new and distinct soul with every human being that comes into existence? And so these questions are kind of esoteric and they're weird. But to believe that God is breathing life into every human being when they're born, like when my child came out of my first, all of my children were C-section, but when they pulled Peyton out, the first one of my born, that God's like blew the life into his nose so that he could breathe. You're taking a description in Genesis and you're trying to make it normative for our value decisions about all life going forward. That's a stretch, man. And we're not given any reason to believe that we're supposed to make that leap. Nowhere does it say, and like that moment, as in all moments from then on. You thought that you can read the tea leaves, that we're having to read the tea leaves to come up with a pro-life position? You are really reading the tea leaves if you're taking that position and saying, well, that applies to all human beings. And granted, there are people that have held that tradition, but that doesn't mean they're right. And we have to recognize that with scientific advancement, our knowledge has grown, that we recognize that respiration in some form is going on inside the body. It's just being done differently. It's taking in oxygen. It's just taking it through the umbilical cord. It's just not breathing it. All that's changed is the manner that it's taking it in. So I think you're placing a lot of importance on something that cannot possibly carry the moral load that you're trying to give it. Because what that means is, until they've taken their first breath, there is nothing wrong I can do to them. Right before they're born, before they can breathe, I can brutally dismember them. That's not wrong. They haven't breathed. And Genesis 1 said that's how Adam became alive. It doesn't even say that's how Eve came alive, by the way. Eve's creation is entirely different. It's not even normative for the second person that comes into existence. It was the first person. That's how they came into existence in the Genesis story. You cannot take from that is true for all human beings forever and always. That is an unnecessarily crazy leap to make. So the first justification is just not possibly. I mean, it's taking the description and making it normative, and that's just a mistake.
He is breaking first century norms about women, talking with women, learning from women, having women lieutenants in his movement. And this was something that was kind of unheard of in the first century. The longest conversation Jesus has with anybody in the whole Bible is with the Samaritan woman at the well. And so this affirmation of women as full and equal people is a huge part of the Jesus movement, especially the early church.
By the way, I agree with that 100%. Within the context of the world that Jesus was operating, his treatment of women was extraordinarily good. And he saw them as equals. And he taught us to see them as equals. And the early church embraced this idea that there are children, there are Christians, there are believers, there are brothers and sisters in Christ, and that our identities culturally are given up for that greater identification. So I absolutely agree that that's a powerful part of Jesus' testimony is how he opens up. I actually think that one of my favorite, then I've actually spoken about this in public, like given speeches about this idea, and I've said this many times on the podcast, the idea of love your neighbor as yourself is made all the more powerful by the fact that Jesus and then the early church are constantly expanding the definition of neighbor. They're always searching for a more inclusive view of neighbor, always moving in that direction, always looking out and saying, who else is my neighbor? Who else is my responsibility? Who else am I commanded to love as I love myself. It's at our best when we're being expansive in our definition of neighbor. All of them. That was one of my favorite things. We've talked about that before. That Pope Francis said, todo, todo, todo. All of them. God wants them all. Todo, all. So I agree with him. But here's the weird thing about what he said. It's this idea that in order for a woman to be fully empowered and equal, by extension of the conversation we're having, she must have access to abortion. Women without abortion are not fully woman or fully equal, not fully empowered. If they can't kill their kids before they're born, they're just not equal to men. Their equality is somehow dependent on access to abortion. What an impoverished view of femininity and womanhood. Do you believe that? I mean, I talk to women who actually take the other side of it. There is a power in their body and their capacity in this world. And by the way, if you look at Genesis chapter 4, I think it is, where Eve has a child, and again, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord, is the English Standard Version translation. But if you read like Leon Cass's book on the book of Genesis and his interpretation of it, he talks about how the actual Hebrew there is less about that God has helped me and more about Eve claiming to be like God. that she, like God, has created life. And that he said that the real definition of this is a very prideful moment of Eve. By the way, Eve talks. Adam never does. This is an interesting aspect of the Bible, but we actually get Eve talking. But Eve's first declaration of the first child that she bears is, I'm like God, making life here, people. I'm cooking life up inside of me. Not like this guy over here. He has no role to play in this. I, Eve, am bearing children. That's amazing. Imagine, and from the moment, and she's actually humbled after the death of Abel at the hands of Cain and her family breaking apart. And the next one, her next proclamation of birth is much more humble as she goes into it. But that idea of, in order, and I've heard this expressed, and I think it was, I want to say, who was the writer of When Harry Met Sally and the director, Nora Ephron. Nora Ephron said something similar one time, and we responded to it in writing, and I may have responded to it in a short podcast as well. This idea that in order for women to be equal, they must have access to abortion. It means, as I think Frank Beckwith has said before, that it is required for women to be equal to men to have a surgical procedure available to them. That's just a weak version of women. Women don't need abortion to be equal to men. They don't need abortion to be fully woman or to be fully equal as members of the society. Their value is not dependent on their ability to get abortion. That's an impoverished view of the power of womanhood. You may want abortion, you may like abortion, but that's nonsense. Women are powerful. Powerful. Not in spite of their ability to get pregnant, but largely even because of that. This wonder ability that they have. They can be all the things that they can be intellectually. They can be all the things that can contribute as far as to the world around us and the business world and law and all of the areas that we see, and in medicine and all the areas that we see them. And they can also bear children. Powerful. And just to say, well, we know that Jesus wanted them to be equal and fully members of society, and they can't do that without abortion. So Jesus would have been for abortion, right? I refuse. I reject that as an impoverished view of what it means as far as for women to be equal. They don't need abortion to be equal. They're every bit of everything that they need to be without that surgical procedure.
And then the last, I think, story I would go to is the story of Mary. Mary is probably my favorite figure in the Bible, the mother of Jesus. And, you know, she's an oppressed peasant teenage girl living in poverty under an oppressive empire as a Jew. And she has a vision from God that she's going to give birth to a baby who's going to bring the powerful down from their thrones, going to scatter the proud, who's going to send the rich away empty. I mean, this revolutionary song that she sings, it's called the Magnificat. And it's actually been banned by certain authoritarian regimes because it is so radical. But I say all this in context of abortion because before God comes over Mary and we have the incarnation, God asks for Mary's consent, which is remarkable. I mean, go back and read this in Luke. I mean, the angel comes down and asks Mary if this is something she wants to do. And she says, if it is God's will, let it be done. Let it be. Let it happen. So to me, that is an affirmation in one of our most central stories that creation has to be done with consent. You cannot force someone to create. Creation is one of the most sacred acts that we engage in as human beings, but that has to be done with consent. It has to be done with freedom, and to me, that is absolutely consistent with the ministry and life and death of Jesus.
Okay. There's a lot to unpack there. I'm sorry to breath dump. I don't mean that to be disrespectful. There's just a lot to unpack in what he just said there. First of all, man, he frames that in like Marxist terms, doesn't he? Mary was part of the oppressed class. And the ruling authorities, those in power that were holding resources, would lose those resources at the birth of Jesus. He would come to redistribute wealth, to take it from the rich, and to deliver the oppressed class. Right out of the gates, I don't know if he means that intentionally. Clearly that there is a worldview going around right now in discussions where the need to see society in terms of the oppressed and the oppressor is the lens by which they understand all things. I think that's a dangerous lens because I wouldn't want anyone to believe themselves to be permanently oppressed or to accept it. If you believe you're oppressed, break free. But, to see and understand yourself as oppressed, I think is a dangerous thing. And we have multiple studies that show that when you see yourself as oppressed, you start to translate the world around you through messages of oppression, whether those are real or not. The famous SCAR test where they gave people scars before they went in for a job interview, showed them the scars and then removed them and then sent them in and then questioned them after the fact because they wanted to see if they would receive any discrimination against having scars in a job interview. And the language of the people that were reading it afterwards were talking about this idea of having the coded words that were used in the interview process that were clearly aimed at the scar that wasn't even there anymore. It had been removed before they went in. They just didn't realize that they'd removed it. They had pretended they were touching it up. But that sense of, he starts right off with this oppression. Let's identify Mary as oppressed, living in an oppressed class, and the bad guys are the oppressors. And Jesus coming will take the wealth from the bad guys, redistribute it among all. Very weirdly Marxist framing of it. Whether he means it to be or not, it's a very strange. Mary's married. You don't have to make her oppressed to make her impressive, right? I mean, she doesn't need you to generate empathy for her by defining her as a member of the oppressed class. She's a young woman that is about to be thrown into the biggest story in all of human history. And her response is already amazing. I'm not one of those Protestants that sees it necessary to minimize Mary all the time. I don't see that as my job to make it sound like Mary was not as impressive as she was. My gosh, her response to what happens is absolutely amazing. But let's go back to what he says. He's talking about Mary being visited by Gabriel. And Gabriel comes and he says, and he came to her and he said, greetings. This is in Luke chapter 1, verse 28. Greetings, O favored one, the Lord is with you. But she was greatly troubled at the saying and tried to discern what sort of greeting this might be. And the angel said to her, do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And behold, you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give to him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end. And Mary said to the angel, how will this be since I am a virgin? And the angel answered her, the Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore, the child to be born will be called Holy, the Son of God. And behold, your relative Elizabeth, in her old age, who was also conceived a son, and is in the 6th month with her, who was called barren. For nothing will be impossible with God. And Mary said, behold, I am the servant of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your word. And the angel departed from her. So he says, James Talerkos, give me scriptural evidence to support the pro-choice view. And he says, number one, God breathed life into man, and so that's how man started, and so nobody's alive till God breathed life to the first breath. We've already talked about that one. The second one, Jesus treated women as equals. I agree with you, but you cannot extend from that women must get abortion to be equal, or that moral problems with abortion are in some way threatening the equality of women, particularly since women are powerful things in society without abortion and always have been. Abortion doesn't make them powerful. It doesn't make them equal. The slip of the tongue there. It may, in the other circumstances. So he says here, then, this is his final and most powerful line of evidence. That when Gabriel visits Mary and tells her what's going to happen, Mary gives consent. And then he says creation must be consented to. That's a false analogy. Number one, because the angel of the Lord, Gabriel, didn't come to her and say, you're already pregnant, but I need your consent. And should you deny consent, you are allowed to take whatever measures are necessary to kill the life within you that is already there and growing. The question was one of conception. Consent was to conception. You can say that life and creation require consent. But once the life is there, the question is, what are you allowed to do to it? And here is the problem. Now, Rogan almost immediately brings up rape after that. But the discussion of when did you give consent to pregnancy? When you did something that you know could result in pregnancy. But the consent that is being offered isn't a consent that grants you the right to abortion. It grants you the right to not become pregnant in the first place. That's what Mary consented to, if you want to read it that way. Mary's consent was to the series of events that were being set in place where she would be conceived through the act of the Holy Spirit, where Jesus' conception would be an act of the Holy Spirit upon her. So we can't take from that, then, his claim that creation requires consent. Therefore, abortion is morally supported in the Bible. What? That's an outrageous leap. And I want to, he seems like a nice guy. He seems like a genuine guy. But you just offered the biblical evidence that abortion is taught in the Bible. This is, remember, at the start of this, I said, remember, that we're talking about a Bible that forbids, as one of the moral laws that are central to our understanding of our relationship to the rest of the world, we are not allowed to unjustly kill other human beings. It is forbidden. It is a book where, even as we're talking about the story that he points to, what does it say about Elizabeth? Elizabeth, who was older, who was considered barren, is 6 months pregnant. The word barren in there to show the judgment upon her. She was seen as a woman who could not have birth and yet, or could not have kids, could not get pregnant, and yet God can do anything. He's taken a barren thing and making her the kind of thing that can birth life. She is with child. She's a 6-month child. She's there, man. This is the story of no killing other human beings, and children are a blessing. And what is your evidence against this that says that we're allowed to kill the unborn before they're born? God breathed life into Adam. Has nothing to do with me, and the very next person that come into existence has a different story altogether. Jesus treated women as if they were equals and raised them out of a lesser role in society through his teaching. 100%. I just refuse to accept that their equality is dependent on their access to abortion. And the final thing is that Mary's consent to conceiving through the Holy Spirit is an indication that creation is an act of consent, or requires an act of consent. Therefore, because Mary consented to conception, you are free to kill your children before they're born. And not just that, that is scriptural support for that view. Come on, man. Come on. This is nothing against you. You seem like a really good guy. Come on. Look, I get it. Your position is, you've said it multiple times in the interview. You talked about believing in women's bodily autonomy. Let's have that argument. Let's have the bodily autonomy argument. Let's have the philosophical discussion. I don't think it does well there either. But if that's your scriptural and theological case for abortion against a book that prohibits the killing of other human beings, identifies individuals before they're born acting in accordance with their character throughout their life, and who sees children as a blessing, if that's your pushback, come on. I mean, come on. And no offense to Joe Rogan, because I find him interesting. I have never watched a whole Joe Rogan episode, never listened to a whole episode. But like all people, I kind of collect things in snippets anyway, and so these things run across my path. I'm not anti-Joe Rogan. I actually think he's an interesting guy. I think it's fascinating that Joe Rogan, who is this workout MMA guy, stand-up comedian, kind of was a, in classic terms, he got famous playing a mook. A mook is a term that advertisers used about 25 years ago, 30 years ago, to describe this kind of male character, this sort of thoughtless bro that was just out there to have fun and to have a good time. And so Joe Rogan plays against that type, goes out, starts a podcast where he invites all kinds of interesting people on, and some of them are more interesting than others, and some of them are more unhinged than others, but he gives them the freedom to talk about their platform, share whatever they believe. He respects them. He lets them say what they want to say. He responds to them. He confronts people when he thinks they're out of line or they're lying. But he was impressed with this guy enough to say, well, I think you should run for president. Well, I mean, based on what we just talked about there, I'm not so sure. Because as much as all that may sound thoughtful and emotive and reasonable and certainly empathetic towards people who want to get abortions, as far as a moral justification of abortion against the evidence of the Bible as being life-affirming and life-celebrating, come on. It's just not there. It's just not there. That doesn't get you there. No way. No, that doesn't mean that people, because the Bible can't be used in that way, that they can't stake out their pro-choice position. It just means don't go to the Bible to get there. It's just not going to be your help, right? We'll have all kinds of other conversations. And then this goes back to one thing I want to say about him at the end. He mentioned several times as we go through that, and we cut out some of it, where he talks about he says early on, he was brought up to believe that part of being a Christian was to hate homosexuals and to be against abortion. And that those were central to what it meant to be a Christian. And he includes some other language in there about what he was supposed to do and how he was supposed to behave. I became a Christian in my 20s. There was never a point that any single person that has ever taught me in my Christian faith before or after has taught me specifically in any church that I've ever been into that part of what I'm supposed to do as a Christian, central to my identity as a Christian, is to hate homosexuals. I was taught that homosexuality is wrong, but let's be very clear, because he talks about that. He talks about mingling with men and the, what is the word he uses? Euphemisms, that they're euphemisms, and that we don't understand the language they were trying to use. And he says, does this apply to women and all that? And he acts like we just couldn't possibly understand what anybody's talking about. It's really not that deep, man. Because when you go into the New Testament where Jesus talks about our relationships with other person, particularly our sexual relationships, Jesus is very clear. Sex outside of marriage is a sin. Lust in your heart for one of your brothers and sisters in Christ is the same as adultery and is a sin. And marriage is between a man and a woman. Now, again, that doesn't mean that you have to be compelled to believe those things, but it does mean that that was what he taught. It's exactly what he taught. And so this doesn't just apply to men with men. It doesn't just apply to women with women. It just applies to men and women outside of marriage. It applies to me as a married man driving down the street or watching TV or whatever. If I start lusting after women, I'm committing adultery. There is one acceptable relationship between me and a woman on that sexual level, and that is with my wife. And those are the terms that we were given to understand it. It's not excluding any particular group. It's excluding everybody except for this one very specific relationship where he says this, in this context, it's blessed and good and meant to be good and enjoyed. And in all the other context, danger Will Robinson. All the other. I was never taught to hate. As a matter of fact, my former pastor, Bryant Wright, who led my church longer than any church I've ever been in, I was under his leadership longer than I've ever been under any pastor's leadership in my life. That man reached out to the gay community every chance he had the opportunity to. He never backed down on believing that homosexuality was a sin, but he also never hated the gay community, not one second I ever saw him. He had meetings every opportunity he had with leadership of the gay community in our community so that he could address both what he was responsible to teach his people in his church, but how they could work together in the community to reach common goals for the good of our community, not to foster division. And there was never, ever any indication that we were allowed to hate homosexuals. As a matter of fact, that was directly preached against. It was just that we think that the homosexual behavior is sinful. I feel sorry for you if you grew up being told that you have to hate gays to be a Christian. That's horrifying. Some of my favorite people I've met in this world that I've sat around and talked to and had a great time with, people I respected and enjoyed their company, were homosexual members of the community, friends that I loved and still love. And I remember the pain of having to have those conversations where after we sat there in this loving relationship, they said, "Can I ask you something? Do you believe that my life is sinful?" And it's, well, it's not a question of what Jay believes. It's a question of what the Bible teaches. I don't have any wiggle room on this, man. I didn't write the Bible. I didn't come up with it. I didn't edit it. It's not looking for Jay's approval. It exists as it is, and I either believe it or I don't. I can cast it off or I can embrace it. One of the two of those things. But what I can't do is rework it for my own good. I mean, I see people that have tried that. Thomas Jefferson, Tolstoy, all these different people that have gone through and reworked the Bible to make them happy. And I always wonder, what the crud are you doing? Where did you get the editor pen from? Who gave it to you? Who gave you the right to take things out and to put things in? I am hogtied on this, man. If I choose to adhere to this belief system, then there are certain things that I have to accept. But believing that somebody sins is not the same thing as believing that I am justified in hating them. I'm not allowed to. That's just not a part of God's plan for me. I'm told to love my enemies. I mean, I'm told to love the people who actively hate me. And they're out there. Some dude the other day in traffic actively hated me more than anybody I've ever seen in my life. I have the slightest idea what I did to set this guy off. Literally pulled up next to me at a stoplight. I'm talking to my daughter who's sitting in the seat next to me. And I see this old man looking at me, probably in his 70s. And JD's staring at me like this, just like staring at me. And I noticed, and I was like, Nika, that dude's staring at me. And she's like, what's going on with that? So I rolled down the window and he looked away. When I rolled down the window, I was like, oh, okay. Well, I thought maybe there was something going on because he started pointing at one point. And then the dude tries to run me off the road. And I got away from him because he freaked me out. He cut me off, tried to run me off. So I whipped around him. I got ahead of him and tried to get into a safe distance. We caught up with other traffic. I slowed down. He pulls up next 2 lanes or a whole lane over. So there's a car between us. I'm waiting in line at the light. He just stops in a turn lane, rolls down his window and starts cussing at me, calling me all these names and making fun of my car, which was really weird. And I was like, man, I have no idea what I did to welcome the hate of this man into my life. But I just smiled back at him. I was like, buddy, I'm called to love people who hate me. I've never ever been told a single day in my life that I'm justified in hating other human beings in any church that I've been in. And if you were, I feel sorry for you. It is not central to Christianity to hate gays, nor is it central in Christianity to hate people who've had abortions. But it is central to Christianity to love our neighbor as ourselves. Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. And I have an expansive, inclusive view of that neighborhood. And he doesn't. James Tallarico doesn't. He has found a group of people that he feels, a category of human life that he feels comfortable excluding from the neighborhood. I don't think he or anybody else has ever given me a good argument as to why I'm justified in excluding them from the neighborhood. The unborn. Have yet to hear anybody give a good defense of why I'm justified in excluding them from the neighborhood. And this is the biggest thing, because the purpose of exclusion is not indifference, it's destruction. They wish to exclude them so that they may destroy them. They're not indifferent to the plight of the unborn. They are hostile to their life by nature. I just think we're better when we have an inclusive view of human value. All right. The last podcast in this studio. We out. There will be more coming in some form or fashion, but you will never again, if you're watching, see this behind you. Never again hear me talking to JD while he's in the room with me. We may do it so that he's remote. We'll figure that out. But Merely Human Ministries. You can follow us on Instagram. You can follow us on, I've got a Substack that I've done under Jay Watts. I'll be writing more and more there over the next year. That will become a major focus as we transition to more writing. You can go to our website, merelyhumanministries.org. You can contact me through that website. But this has been the Human Things Podcast, and we thank you for your listening.